Explain your topic of architecture in world history. Sounds rather fascinating. Now, did architecture affect world history, or did world history affect architecture?
Well, actually both.
Okay.
If somebody says the word architect or architecture to you, what picture comes into your mind? What do you think of?
Usually an ornate building of some sort.
An ornate building. Mm-hmm. Well, that's part of it. Architecture and its history is one of those things that I think of as a chain. It begins very early, and it develops through millennia, and it's still with us today. It's a key part of civilization, quote unquote, and it shows lots of interesting developments. Sometimes it goes around in a circle, sometimes it goes straight. Well, architecture is very much in that fold, because the earliest evidences of, well, and I should pause here and say the actual meaning is of an architect is top builder. The archy is the same as in archbishop or arch, or one of those things. So it's, I take that to mean planned building, because you can go out in the yard and build a snow person, but a planned building that you're going to build, or a monument, that's what really is architecture.
Okay.
So what we have as the very beginning is about 12,000 years ago, and there probably was something before that. And before that, there were certainly living in caves,
right,
and putting up mud walls and things like that. But the first development of it is a building they think might have been some kind of religious building, and it's in Turkey, in Anatolia, where a lot of early remains have been found. Egypt goes back that far. We don't have any actual building remnants, but that's another interesting thing, because the effects of climate and geography, topography and all, on architecture are very great. And Egypt being the climate's in, see, Anatolia has a rugged climate, basically hot summer, cold and winter storms. Egypt is warm all year round, so you see some differences there.
Right.
But now the things that people constructed include obvious things like protection, shelters, defenses, things that are indicating dominance. Now, you mentioned Versailles. That's nothing but conspicuous consumption. Mm-hmm. You don't need all that to just live in the place and have protection against the elements, or not so much against the enemy, but it's conspicuous consumption, and it shows you're not probably planning to be attacked anytime soon. Mm-hmm. But you have not only, see, the things that you can construct are not only buildings. They can be monuments, they can be other, well, things like Hatshepsut's obelisks, for example. They demonstrate power and authority, but they're also art. Mm-hmm. They're artistic objects. Right. They fall into many categories. So you wonder whether an architect actually is an artist, a scientist, an engineer, or any one of a number of other things. And the answer is that they are all.
A combination.
And I think most architects probably do it all. Now, they don't actually get out and put brick upon brick, but they supervise. They design it, and they supervise it then when it's actually being constructed. There's a movie where Gary Cooper plays an architect, and you see it in that. He has these dreams, of this great building, and he's actually out there on the girders watching and supervising. So it's a very active thing there. But the other things that you can put up with it will include monuments, and they will include I said fortresses, for defense. And sometimes those two coincide. The medieval castles, fortified towns, the Burg, so they all go together. So many, many different things. And you can scarcely picture an architect sitting at a desk planning one of these things, and yet somebody did, of course, plan them, make the
Right.
plans, and then they were carried out. So that actually now they were put up. Let's see, religion is another thing. Protection against the elements, religion, putting on the dog, establishing your power, and cultural things like theaters. And very early, people were putting on plays.
The big arenas, yeah, the big
And-
coliseums.
And sporting events, exactly, yes, that's right. Now, why were they putting up buildings for this? Well, that pretty well goes with what we've just said, because they, probably there was some urge to be creative, but you needed these things. And a lot of my pictures were lost in a computer disaster.
Oh, dear.
But we're going to see a few shots anyway later on, and we'll see a couple of examples of using palm fronds and straw for things. And then later on in the Industrial Revolution, when they began to be able to really manipulate metals.
Make the steel beams and that type of thing.
Yeah, and earlier than that, of course, they knew how to smelt. 3000 and more BC, they could smelt metal and use it to build things, but they couldn't do the things that require the real power, like putting up a huge dome,
No.
which came on later. But you could almost tell about a civilization by looking at the buildings. If you can see pictures of them or recreate what they were, you can tell a lot about it. It took a lot of resources, for example, for those pyramids to be put up, those big ones in Egypt in the 2nd millennium BC. And it took a lot to build Hagia Sophia in Byzantium, in Istanbul. So you had to have a society that had this wealth, and they had to be in control. Because, of course, at the same time, you had people living in just sort of knock-ups and caves and so on. Now, how did they do this? Well, it depended a lot on the resources at hand, what you had right there to build with. So in Egypt, you had stone, and it's still a miracle today. Egypt is a big exception to some of this development, because they knew how to do some of these things that haven't really figured it out yet today.
How they did it, right.
How they could do that, how they could hew them out of the rock and then get them onto something and then lift them. And those pyramids are high. And if have you ever been to the pyramids
No,
in
I
Egypt?
haven't.
Well, it looks as though you could just kind of walk, step by step, but you can't. Those blocks are so high, each one of them. So the materials and the ability to move them around were a very, very key part of it. And you saw that developing apace. Now, after the Egyptians, nobody was able to do quite such spectacular things, but they were also good on the small engineering tasks, which also count, like irrigation. They had a thing like that child's toy they used to have in our childhood, where you turned a crank, a little metal thing, there was a little metal, like a little sort of tub at the bottom, and you turned a crank and a chain went around with the little receptacles on
buckets,
it,
yeah.
and they'd go down there into that and pick up the water, and then they'd turn it out later. Well, the Egyptians did all that. That had to be designed by somebody, and it was. I think they actually found certain things that showed plans, and of course
It's interesting how that got lost somewhere along the line as to how they did that.
it is. There are all kinds of good theories about cutting the stone and cutting it out for these obelisks, which were 300-400 feet tall, of one solid piece of rock. And they found a couple of them that cracked somewhere along the line and were rejected, of course. But they think that perhaps sledges, these kind of sleds that you could pull over the sand, were a good deal of it. And of course they had the labor, and contrary to general belief, the laborers were not whipped to death,
Right.
tugging, because they wouldn't have been any good. But speaking of the laborers, we realize another function of architecture was not only building buildings, it was building compounds, neighborhoods, as it were. And you saw that in India, on the Ganges River plain. You saw that going way, way back, several thousand years back. And these laborers in Egypt, we have actual remains of those archaeologists have dug up whole whole neighborhoods, whole centers. And they were built pretty much out of clay-like, you know, building up earthenware. But they had streets, and they had little rooms and so on, and some of the early rooms, like the early rooms for the aristocrats too, but then the aristocrats graduated to largely open-air things. The Egyptians could not, for example, if you've ever seen pictures of Luxor or been to Luxor, they have these huge fat columns.
Yes.
Inscriptions all over them, open to the sky. And the cross pieces on the top, they got those up there in a very clever way by doing the columns in sections. You would do the section, and then you would put the Greeks did that too, and then you could handle it. But at any rate, this went on in most of the world, probably all of the world, where there were people who would reach the stage of human beings where they knew how to do these things, where they needed them, where they needed to try to keep warm in the winter, where they perhaps needed to hold water, they perhaps needed tools, kill animals. So they learned how to make things. And we found a lot of fascinating stuff on that score. I mean, hooks and things made out of animal products. You can make things out of bone and leather and so on. So they were all put in line there. Now, around 12,000 BC, when this was going on, elsewhere in the world, we really don't know exactly what was happening. There were human beings, or mostly human beings, in these other places. But it was not until somewhat later than that we find these great civilizations rising and know about them because of remnants. In India, as I've mentioned, there were civilized people and they were building things. All around in Mesopotamia they tended to use brick, the resources they had there. Right. They didn't have a lot of stone like the Egyptians did, but the Egyptians had a lot of stone which they could take out and dress, and they also dug into solid rock, and they have whole complexes of buildings underneath. You may have seen the pictures under Ramses II. It's a whole dig right down through the solid rock, and then have corridors and branches off from them, and little, I like chapels on the ends of these things. Quite remarkable. In North American continent, we don't have anything that elaborate for that early. But shelters, of course, were going on at that time. Right. And there were cave dwellers, the North American Indians, for instance, extensive evidence of that. And then later on, I don't know if you could count it as architecture or not, but the teepees made of leather, I think you probably could.
Oh, I don't know why not.
Because they were structures.
Sure.
And you could take them up and put them down. Or you got to put them up and take them down. I got reversed there. But you find that also in people like the Mongols. Mm-hmm. The Mongols, it's interesting, were not a building, they were nomads. So they were not a building people. All these other people were not nomads. They were beyond the
they were settled
hunter-gatherer stage, whatever. Right. But the Mongols were very clever. They moved their society all the time, mainly for purposes of grazing for their animals. They were heavily dependent on their, particularly horses. But they could set them up and take them all down. They had big tents, and heavy horsehair, like canvas, going over them. Right. So they didn't really need to build anything, and didn't. And the Chinese took them over. They still really didn't build much. Now, the Chinese, there's evidence that they were building a long time ago, too. But I've forgotten exactly when it was that they learned how to make pagodas. They learned how to make multi-story things. But what they were big on was these compounds, these whole neighborhoods sort of within one, what would you say, well, I think oftentimes they had some kind of a wall around, well, they did have a wall around the more modern ones. But instead of having individual houses, and of course they built the Forbidden City, this was a whole area. This was not just putting up a huge palace at Versailles or something. It was it was more going on there. Well, as you go forward in history, then you have the very poor and the agriculture and so on living either out in the open, in caves, in any kind of knock-to shelters, and you have the upper classes really constructing things. The Greeks are probably the next important builders, and in the high period of Athens, that was in the 5th century BC, where all the famous philosophers and all this was going on. They built these beautiful things, like the Parthenon, for example.
Right.
And this was a type of architecture which was destined to influence the world to this very day, where you had columns, and then on the top of the columns you had an architrave, and on top of that you had a pediment, the triangular shaped thing, which you decorated. And they were very, very clever. The designers, they designed out the last inch, and they had probably learned by experience. Everybody knows about their famous trick of making the columns slightly off. They're not perfectly straight, but they're slightly off because they won't look straight unless you vary them slightly.
Oh,
Well, so they built far and wide, and they pretty much handed that off to the Romans. The Romans, of course, built extensively, and they're some of the ones conspicuous. They're like the French kings. They're conspicuous wealth and power.
Right.
They were built. The Romans were also very good at military things. There were not so many things right there in Rome. They never expected anybody to get to Rome, of course, and attack them there. But their military camps, there's one in Germany, Saalbach, and we visited that one, and it's really interesting how they constructed it. And the ones in England, we had a show on the Romans in England one time, and how they built there and how they built the wall, and their amazing feats and the heating it. They used the naturally heated water, the springs, to heat it around. But this took hold, and ever after, some of these tricks were used.
Right.
Now, after the Romans, of course, the Roman Empire split, as you recall, and the Roman Empire in Rome started to go to pieces in the 5th century AD, in the 400s. And some of it sort of migrated to the east, in Byzantium, as they called Istanbul in those days.
Oh, okay.
And so you had Goths up there above them. The Goths, too, threatened everybody in Europe. And why they call medieval architecture Gothic, I don't know. Because the Goths, too, were nomadic people, basically nomadic. And they did not build a lot of solid structures. They were used to getting around and capturing other peoples. But there was a lot of wonderful building in Byzantium then, in the Eastern Roman Empire. St. Sophia, Hagia Sophia, is a beautiful, beautiful, it's huge, it was built as a church. It has an enormous dome. I've been there, and you stand there, and there's a huge dome. It's certainly as impressive, I think, as St. Peter's in Rome, which is another thing. You say Vatican in Rome, first thing that comes to your mind, is that huge St. Peter's.
Right.
But the one in Istanbul, and was eventually taken over by the Turks, of course, who did not spoil it. There are Arabic letters, Arabic words around here and there, but otherwise they were not great builders the way some of the other ones were. But they lasted until the 1450s, when the Ottoman Turks took them over. But in the meantime, the Mongols, we mentioned them, the 1300s, the 12th century was their big time. They got clear to Central Europe.
Right.
And they took Hungary, and they were in the middle of Germany, and they were, of course, consolidating as they went on. They didn't want anybody to integrate particularly. They just sat on them hard and collected taxes, something like what the Arabian empires did later on.
Right.
But that empire stopped. The Mongol Empire stopped because the current Khan died, the great Khan, and all the other the lesser Khans, the relatives, had to go back and have a committee meeting and pick the new one. So they just left. And they had I think, really little or no effect on what we're talking about here, the building, because they simply didn't build buildings.
Right.
They could whip up these settlements with their yurts on a moment's notice if they needed to. Otherwise, they sort of lived on horseback. But in 1453, the Ottoman Turks took them over, and the Ottoman Turkish Empire began and lasted. I think we mentioned them before. They're an important force in history, although culturally they were good. But they did not. They were not great builders either, in the sense that we think of it. The Crusaders came in there. The Crusaders, of course, only lasted for 100, 200 years. They were out. So anything they had tried to build, there's a church in Jerusalem, a Crusader church that's still there, and a lot of their castles are around. You see them, there's a big one down by the Dead Sea, and you see them in places in Greece. You can still see Crusader castles with their crenellated walls, and the crenellations went up like this and then dipped in the middle. They're very distinctive instead of being the solid across. So they were not terribly great builders. When you think of the Turkish Empire, you don't think too much of buildings. But if you think of the Roman Empire, you certainly think of buildings and key buildings. In the medieval period, there was a lot of church building, of course, cathedrals and churches. They were, all over Europe, anywhere that was Catholic. In fact, even in Spain, there were some churches built. There was that wonderful period in Spain where you had Muslims occupying part of it and Christians, and then Jews. You had a large Jewish component, and it was culturally very, very rich. And you had beautiful buildings. The Alhambra, it was one that I've never seen it, but apparently is as impressive, much more impressive in person than it is when you see it. Like the Taj Mahal, you've seen pictures, but you just don't believe it until you see it. But you think of India, mention a structure in India, most people would say, the Taj Mahal, something like that. So architecture tends to encapsulate a lot of things by it. And you asked if, at the very beginning there, when I said what you think of, it's past, influence, and the future. Well, it's exactly that. It's this chain that I think of, where each one builds on the advances of the other, the building advances. Some are sudden changes, like the classical architecture, the Roman, and that hung on amazingly. The Egyptian hung on, except that it's harder to imitate. It's not imitated as much as the others.
Probably because of the building materials, wouldn't you think?
Well, that might
Being
well
so
be.
different, right.
And of course, the climate, to imitate it exactly, you'd have to do it in a warm climate. It wouldn't hang on so much. But the end result of a lot of this then was that you had, as the medieval period proceeded, you had the Gothic arch. This was something of a change in the way the churches were built. Before that, any kind of a temple or a church had been a simple, certainly for the Christians, a simple thing. I mean, in Rome, for instance, they had very simple meeting places, even when they became the official religion of some of these empires. But the Gothic style is a style that's more or less vertical, and of course, little by little, they had learned to not only to pile stone upon stone and to strengthen wood, to make joints in wood, but they had learned things like that beautiful, it looked almost like a concrete lace in some of the of the churches in Europe. It was a very, very popular style, the Gothic arches. And in England, you had a style developing that was largely along those lines, prominent one. Over here, we adopted a lot of the English things too. Typical church architecture is the Gothic arch and the jointing in the wall and the ceiling. So you see the wide-reaching effects of it, and yet it all started out very, very modestly with these getting to use the materials in the earlier societies. As more modern times went on, you kept having things for the old style.
Yes.
Neoclassic,
Neoclassic, neo-Gothic, yeah.
Neo-Gothic. There's a style called Romanche, which is the heavy. It's more like the Roman arches were all round. And you notice that in the old churches. The Russians picked up that type of thing. It makes their buildings or their interiors look more squat somehow. Heavy pillars and then these rounded, decorated arches on top of them. And nothing terribly spectacular outside. The Romans, however, or the Russians developed their onion dome.
Right.
Their distinctive onion dome. That was something different. A huge change began to occur at the end of the 1800s, and this was the modernistic. Another style that was very different from what had gone before, like the classical, introducing something very new. And this was modern art, Art Nouveau. The old stuff was sometimes called Art Ancien, the old art. And the term got into music and literature as well. They began to influence each other.
Right.
But at the end of the 1900s, again, you had this beginning, the Beaux-Arts. You had people, the Russian ballet is a good example of what began to happen, because the ballets, of course, were designed and planned, and people like Leon Bakst and other designers, very modernistic, bright, bold splashes of color, zigzag lines. The stage settings were pretty fabulous. That began, and the Russian ballet was just full of that, and the music itself began to take that on. The architecture was changing. There were not so many of the new type things, because the old have hung on, as you have been saying here. That the Roman has held on remarkably. Right. The Greek and the Roman styles. Of
course, now we have all these very straight structures with all the glass. And
that's another thing that came along, the ability to use glass and have transparent, and of course plastic to some extent. But you had the Dada people with their strange ideas, making odd combinations of words, never mind what they meant for shape. Well, that began to show up in architecture as well. The most famous name probably in American architecture is Frank Lloyd Wright.
Right.
And for him, no holds were barred either. No pediments at your front door with a couple of columns on the side, maybe with Corinthian. No, none of that anymore. What you had was very imaginative designs. A lot of the things, it struck me when I was looking at some pictures for this, and it struck me when I was a child. I lived in an area where there are a lot of his things in Illinois. They're dark, they're dusky, they have overhangs, they're shadowed. His Falling Waters is probably his most famous thing, the one in Pennsylvania, where he tried to just build it right in with nature.
And we are down into the last minute of our show.
Oh no! Don't say that. I wanted to just say a little more about him and how interesting he was. Maybe we should quick look at. I say this computer disaster, but I do have a few pictures that, if we could see them, please, illustrate some of the things we've been talking about. Could we see the pictures?
I read something about Frank Lloyd Wright the other day that his architecture was very imaginative, but not very practical.
Well, it was practical in some ways. His pictures, I guess we're not going to...
I guess we're not.
Oh, yes, we are. This is one of his houses. This is a residence house. And very steep, and as you were saying, not practical. You look at that and you say, this is something out of a fairy tale. You couldn't have attics or rooms or anything up. It would be impossible. Go on to the next one, please. This one, I had trouble with these pictures too, so that did take. Here's one that's very unusual again. This looks more like some pipe joining another pipe, and having the jointure there. Now that one is his studio, and that's one that I know well because that's in Oak Park in Illinois, and a piano teacher used to live in that house when I was in high school, And walking home from high school, I passed that, or I could pass it, depending on which route I took. And one of my friends took piano lessons, and I used to pick her up afterward, and we'd go out and eat a goodie, you know, on our way home from school. And you go inside there, and it's very imaginative. There's an atrium, but there's an actual tree. There's no roof. The roof comes up close, you know, as far as it can come. And of course, they're all dusky and dark. Maybe he had sort of a dark personality.
That's what I understand.
Yeah, well, he did. But now, it's a beautiful place there because there are trees. And actually being in one of those, the post office looked like some kind of a bastion. You couldn't see any visible means of getting in or out. And that's highly unusual because that's one thing that a building must have. You must be able to see the in or out.
We are going to have to go to the announcement, so.
Okay, well,
If anybody has any more questions about this architecture, I'm sure Jane would love to talk to you about it. And it is a fascinating study.
It's so interesting.
So
But
stop her in the hallway and pick her brain a little bit.